Welcome, learner, to your custom deep dive. You gave us a really interesting set of documents, and it's
Yeah,
all about artificial intelligence regulation. And it
right.
seems like you're really keen on understanding this from the European and Spanish perspective. So
Uh,
we've dug through all these PDF reports and presentation transcripts, even some Q&A stuff to try to pull out like the really key insights for you.
yeah, absolutely. And I think the main, well, I guess your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to really understand how AI is being regulated right now in Europe. Like what's going on?
Okay.
Who are the key players? What are their obligations? And we want to make sure you don't feel overwhelmed because there's a lot of information here, but we're going to focus on the really important things. So you walk away feeling confident.
Right. And I think one of the central themes that we're going to be looking at is this concept of guerrilla,
Yes.
which refers to the regulation itself, and gobernanza, which is governance.
Right.
And how this applies to, organizations that are using AI, developing AI, as well as the governmental bodies that are overseeing it. We're looking at it from both sides.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And I think what's really interesting is how much the EU is putting fundamental rights front and center
Yeah.
here, especially the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, like
Hmm.
the general principles of law. And that seems to be a really important part of their whole approach to AI development and deployment in Europe.
Yeah.
They really want to encourage innovation, but at the same time, they want to make sure that everything's compliant with the regulations.
Well, and that makes sense because, organizations already have to comply with all kinds of things. So
Right.
it's not like this idea of governance is new, right?
Yeah.
But AI brings a whole new set of things.
Absolutely. A whole new,
We're going to have to think
a
about.
whole new layer. So let's jump into that. Let's talk about what this looks like. For organizations, what is this internal organizational governance? So your documents really emphasize that any organization, whether they're developing AI or even just using AI tools,
Right.
needs to have these really clear internal governance frameworks.
And it's not just, like I said, we have this framework. It's like you actually have to have the policies, the procedures, and the processes, the instructions, all of that.
Yes, absolutely. And a really important part of that is risk management, right?
Uh-huh.
And especially when it comes to these high-risk AI systems. They're really emphasizing that you need to establish a system, you need to implement it, document it, maintain it. It's
Oh,
not
so it's not just like a one-time thing.
it's not a one-time thing, this risk management. It's ongoing. It's throughout the whole life cycle of the AI system.
Right. So like every time you're looking at the AI system, you have to be reassessing like, okay,
Yeah.
what are the risks right now?
Yeah, they're saying, yeah, it's a continuous process and it has to happen over and over again.
And it's interesting because it's like organizations are going to have to know where they stand with compliance and assess their risk and then look at, okay, what's it going to cost us if we don't comply?
Right.
And what's it going to cost us if we do comply?
And I think that's
But it's a balancing act.
risk-based approach, right?
Yeah.
That's really important in your materials.
Okay.
And they're saying focus on where it could potentially be the most harmful.
Right.
Like that's where you should be spending your time and resources.
And you can't, so let's say you have a high risk system, right? You can't just deploy it and say, okay, we're done.
No, exactly. It
have
has
to-
to be continuous evaluation, constant monitoring. That's really crucial for these high-risk systems.
Yeah.
You really got to be checking how they're performing.
So it's like they're being watched like a hawk.
Yeah.
And what's interesting?
Yeah.
Beyond just the technical aspects, right? Of okay, are these systems working? The documents really highlight how important it is for organizations to have these clear ethical principles in place
Yeah, for sure.
around how they're using and developing these systems.
Yeah, and not just the rules, but really embedding ethical considerations in how you're using these technologies.
Right.
And also, making sure that you can actually audit and track what these systems are doing.
Right.
So if there's ever a non-compliance audit, you got the logs.
Yeah.
You got the records to show.
And so then that's where those activity logs are so important.
Right.
You mentioned early warning mechanisms.
Yes.
What does that look like in an organization?
Well, think of it like having these internal processes where if something starts to go wrong, like a warning light comes on.
Oh, okay.
You catch it early before it becomes a big issue.
So it's like, okay, this is about to go sideways.
Yeah.
Let's get this.
Right. Intervene early.
Right.
And hopefully prevent bigger problems later on.
Okay.
And, it's not just about managing AI in isolation really, right? You've got to think about your cybersecurity, your data protection. All those things have to work together.
Right.
So coordinating your AI systems with your cybersecurity
Okay.
is really, really important. That's how you make sure your systems are robust, they're secure, they're effective, and most importantly, they're not going to cause harm.
And it seems like the high-risk AI systems, they have like even more
Oh yeah, they definitely have a higher bar.
standards to...
Yeah, they're expected to comply with these really, really high technical standards. I mean, they even mention ISO 2701 for information security as an example.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, they're really emphasizing high
Yeah.
standards here.
So that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, yeah. And this is something I thought was really interesting, intellectual property rights.
Yeah.
They're saying AI systems that scrape the web, they could be reading legal notices on websites.
Right.
So that's a whole other area where things can get...
Well, yeah, because if they're reading the legal notices, does that mean they're bound by them?
Well, that's a great question.
Right.
And to be honest, the law is still catching up in this area.
Yeah.
We're not 100% sure what the implications are yet. So if you're a company deploying AI,
Right.
you need to be aware of this and be really, really careful.
Okay, so let's say something, inevitably something happens with one of these systems, right?
Right.
They mention using a RACI matrix. What is a RACI matrix?
Oh, yeah. That's a great tool for figuring out who's responsible for what.
Okay.
So it stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed.
Okay.
So it basically helps you map out every task, every decision, and say, okay, who's doing the work? Who's ultimately responsible? Who do we need to talk to? And who just needs to be kept in the loop?
So it's like everyone knows their role, everyone knows what they're accountable for.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's really important for AI governance because you need to know who's going to step up if things go wrong.
And then that ties into the ongoing training and communication plans that are so, so important.
Oh, absolutely.
Because as things change, as the technology changes, as the regulations change,
right,
you've got to keep everyone up to speed.
You got to keep everyone informed about the latest risks, the best practices, the policies, the updates, all of that.
So this is like, they talk about the activity logs and keeping records of compliance, and it's all part of being...
It's all about accountability.
Right.
Being able to prove that you've been doing things right.
Okay.
And they also mentioned these periodic legal compliance audits, specifically for AI.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like getting those legal experts in to check if everything's still up to snuff.
Right.
And also designing really clear command chains. Who reports to who?
So there's no confusion.
Exactly. You want to make sure there's clear oversight and everyone knows who's in charge.
Right.
Especially when it comes to these AI systems that are being trained on these massive data sets. Yeah. Data governance and management practices are super important.
And that's where the data quality comes in.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you have garbage in, you're going to get garbage out.
Garbage in, garbage out.
The system.
Exactly, yeah. So you want to make sure that data is accurate, it's relevant, it's good quality.
Right.
And they really hammer home this point about transparency with the data. Where's the data coming from? Is it good quality? Is it fair? Is it biased?
And this is especially true when you're talking about like data that's being transferred internationally.
Oh, absolutely.
Where you have different control authorities.
Yeah. And when it comes to personal data, you need to make sure you're complying with all those regulations.
Right.
Data protection is really important in this context.
And they're saying even if you have an AI system that's not considered high risk, you should...
you should still follow those ethical codes.
Okay.
Be proactive, build a culture of responsible AI development.
So it's like even if you don't have to do it legally...
Yeah, do it anyway.
It's a good idea to still follow those ethical codes.
Right. And when it comes to personal data, remember data minimization.
Yeah, okay.
Only collect what you need.
Okay.
And anonymization, make that data unidentifiable.
And that's
super important for protecting people's privacy.
Right.
And ideally, you want that data processing to be irreversible.
What do you mean irreversible?
So once you've anonymized that data, you can't go back and figure out who it belongs to.
Oh, okay.
It's like gone.
Okay.
It's for the long-term protection of privacy.
Okay.
And before you even start using AI with personal data, do a risk analysis.
Okay.
Figure out what the privacy risks are.
Okay, so that should be like the first thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And then based on that, you can figure out what safeguards you need.
Okay.
Make sure you're meeting those GDPR requirements.
And they talk about this FRIA, a fundamental rights impact assessment.
Right.
So how is that different from a DPIA?
So a DPIA, a data protection impact assessment, focuses specifically on privacy.
Right.
But And FRIA takes a much wider view.
Okay.
It says, okay, how could this AI system impact all sorts of fundamental rights?
Okay.
Non-discrimination, freedom of expression, all these rights that are enshrined in the European Charter.
It's like looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, and then transparency about automated individual decisions.
Right, yeah.
So if an AI is making a decision that affects you, you have the right to know about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And sometimes you might need a contract, you might need explicit consent, or there might be a legal basis for that processing.
Right.
But either way, people need to know when AI is making decisions that affect them.
Okay.
And of course, when you're dealing with personal data, confidentiality, access controls, those are super important.
Right, so making sure the right people
Yeah. Make sure only authorized people
have access.
can access that sensitive information.
And, it's funny because even with all this new AI, all the things that we were always told about, like, okay,
Right.
update your antivirus.
Basics still matter.
Right.
Yeah.
All that stuff still applies to AI, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Updates, antivirus, firewalls, encryption, backups.
Right.
All of that is still super important for AI security.
Okay.
And you need clear policies for how people are using AI, especially when it comes to personal data. Who's responsible for what?
So everyone knows what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do.
Exactly. You want to prevent unauthorized use.
Right.
And to do that, you need employee awareness.
Right.
Make sure people know the risks, how to use AI properly.
And it sounds like they're suggesting that, maybe organizations should think about having a dedicated AI regulatory compliance committee.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Get a group of people together from different parts of the organization, make sure they're all on the same page, and their job is to make sure you're complying with all these AI regulations.
And it sounds like you need a compliance plan.
Oh, absolutely. With objectives, with a scope.
You need a plan.
Right. You need to know what AI systems you're talking about, risk assessments, all of that.
Right, yeah. And it's got to be a living document.
Okay.
You got to keep updating it as things change.
And it sounds like they're saying, maybe organizations should think about having like a technology master plan.
Yeah, I like
that incorporates all of this, right?
Integrate AI ethically, responsibly, and reliably.
Right. So it's not just like we're using AI, but like it's part
of your overall strategy.
Right.
Yeah. And before you even start, do that risk inventory.
Okay.
What are your AI assets? Who owns them? Who's responsible for them?
Right. If you don't know what you have, how are you going to
Exactly.
get them?
And for those AI systems that are learning from data, you got to make sure that data is good quality.
Right. So all those training data sets, all that stuff.
Yeah, it's got to meet those quality criteria.
Okay. So that was a lot about what organizations need to be thinking about. Yeah, that was a lot.
But now let's talk about what's happening outside of the organization,
right?
The external oversight. So we've got the AI regulation, the BRIA,
right,
and we've got the governanza, the governance at the governmental level.
Right. So the BRIA, that's all about making sure that the authorities can actually supervise what's going on with AI.
Okay.
Are people actually following the rules?
Right.
Are they complying with the principles and the directives?
And then the governanza refers to like the actual institutions,
right? Yeah,
that are going to be doing this supervising.
Yeah, especially for these really powerful AI systems.
Yeah.
Like the general purpose ones with multimodal capabilities.
It's like ChatGPT.
Right, that kind of thing.
And they're really focused on monitoring any potential harmful effects.
Okay.
Fundamental rights, public health, public order.
And then they talk about this European Artificial Intelligence Office that was established in January of 2024. So what's its job? So basically their main job is to make sure that the AI regulation is implemented consistently across all the EU member states.
Okay.
So everyone's on the same page.
Right. So you don't have one country doing one thing and another country doing another thing.
And then you've got the European AI board.
Okay. What is that?
So they're going to have representatives from each of the EU member states.
Okay.
And their job is to make sure that the regulation is applied consistently.
Right. So again,
That's all about.
Same thing?
Yeah. Consistency, harmonization.
And so is it similar to like...
Yeah, they compare it to the European Data Protection Board.
Okay.
So it's kind of like that, but for AI.
And so this board, it will coordinate among...
Yeah, they'll coordinate the national competent authorities.
Okay.
And they'll issue guidelines.
So they'll make sure everyone's following the same rules.
Exactly, yeah. And they mentioned these authorities of connection and authorities of vigilance.
Oh.
So these are basically national authorities that are going to help out the European AI Office and the AI Board.
Nope.
They're going to be the eyes and ears on the ground, so to speak.
And they're going to make sure everything's being enforced.
Right. And the authorities of vigilance,
Okay.
they're going to be working really closely with the European AI board.
And then there's these subgroups within the board.
Yeah, so they're going to have subgroups for different things.
Okay.
Like, they're going to have one for market surveillance.
Okay.
So that'll probably involve people from, like, national commissions, data protection agencies, people who are experts in making sure the market is playing by the rules.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And then in each member state, they're going to have this notifying authority.
Okay.
Your job is to pick out these notified bodies.
Okay.
And these notified bodies, they're the ones who are going to check if the AI systems are actually complying with the regulation. Okay. And if they are, they'll give them a certification.
Okay, so it's like these...
Yeah, so it's like a seal of approval.
These groups of experts that are going to be put together, and they're going to...
They're going to be the brains of the operation.
Okay.
They're going to provide all the expertise, especially for those general-purpose AI systems.
And
it'll be working closely with the European AI office.
Okay.
So it's a real team effort.
And they're also going to have a consultative forum to get input from.
Yeah, they want to make sure they're getting input from everyone, not just the experts.
Okay.
So they'll have representatives from industry, from academia, from civil society.
So all the different stakeholders?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, and then they talk about these timelines.
Right.
So
the regulation has specific deadlines for when things need to be implemented.
Okay.
And some things are already in effect.
Like what?
Well, for example, they've already banned certain AI practices that are considered unacceptable risk.
Oh, wow, so they're not wasting any time.
No, they're definitely taking this seriously.
Okay, and then they're going to have a database of high-risk systems.
Right, they're going to keep track of all the high-risk AI systems that are out there.
So anyone can see.
Yeah, it's all about transparency.
What's being used and what's considered high risk.
Yeah, and national authorities can actually ban certain systems within their own countries.
Oh, interesting.
But they have to coordinate at the European level.
Okay, so again, making sure everyone's on the same page.
Making sure everything's consistent.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you're a provider of a high-risk system, you have to monitor it even after you've put it on the market.
Okay.
And if anything happens that could violate fundamental rights or create a safety risk, you have to report it.
So you can't just wash your hands of it?
No. You're responsible for the whole life cycle.
Okay.
And they're going to have this independent group of scientific experts to advise all these regulatory bodies.
So they'll make sure the regulation is based on the latest science.
Exactly, yeah.
And then the European Data Protection Supervisor, they're going to be overseeing how AI is being used within the EU institutions themselves, right?
Right, yeah.
So making sure
that everyone's following the data protection rules.
Okay, and then they talk about the digital single market, right?
Yeah, the EU wants to create this digital single market.
Right.
But they're facing challenges in terms of global competitiveness.
Right, especially compared to the U.S.
Yeah, because they're really prioritizing ethical considerations, and sometimes that can make it harder to compete. And
then they have the European Declaration on Digital Rights and Principles from 2023.
Right, so that's kind of like a broader framework for the whole digital environment.
Okay.
It sets the stage for the AI regulation.
And then they talk about this European AI Pact.
Yeah, so that's where a bunch of countries got together and agreed on these key digital principles. Right. They want to make sure everyone's on the same page when it comes to digital transformation.
Okay, and so the EU's AI regulation, the goal is really to make sure that AI is secure, transparent, and ethical, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And they talk about Article 50 being really important because it outlines the transparency obligations.
Yeah, Article 50 is all about making sure that people know how these systems work and what they can do.
Okay, and then we have to remember that each member state has to take the European AI regulation and put it into their own national legal system.
Right, they have to transpose it.
And Spain has already made a lot of progress with that.
Yeah, they've got a draft law on AI governance that they're working on.
So they're really moving quickly?
Yeah, they want to make sure they're ready to go when the regulation comes into effect.
Okay, so let's talk about this risk categorization because they say there are 4 levels.
Right, yeah.
Unacceptable risk, which is prohibited.
You can't do it.
High risk, which means there's a lot of requirements, lots of rules. Limited risk, which is mostly about transparency.
Just be open about what you're doing.
And then minimal risk, where there's very few requirements.
Pretty much anything goes.
And it seems like they expect most AI systems to be in the limited or minimal risk categories.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay, so the high-risk ones, there's a
Okay.
lot more scrutiny.
Yeah, because they could have a bigger impact on fundamental rights and safety.
Right, and then they say that
Yeah.
some AI systems that are used for verification, they might not be considered high risk.
Right, because they might not pose the same level of threat.
Okay, and then this whole thing about defining general purpose AI,
Yeah, that's a tricky one.
they're still figuring that out.
Right.
Yeah, it's a work in progress.
Okay.
But it's really important because it'll determine which AI systems have to follow all those extra rules.
Okay, and then this whole thing about legal implications and responsibilities.
Right.
So if you're an organization,
And you're using an AI system and it produces an output that's like bad or wrong or unfair,
right?
you can be held legally responsible for that.
Yeah, especially if you haven't done your due diligence,
Right.
made sure the system's been properly validated.
And that's where the data protection officers come in.
Oh, yeah, the DPOs, they're super important.
Right.
They're the ones who are going to make sure you're complying with all of those data protection regulations.
And then all those other laws that we already have,
Right.
like GDPR and NIS2,
All of those still apply.
they're all going to interact with this AI regulation.
So it's a complex web of rules.
Right. And then labor law
Yeah, that's a big one, too.
is being impacted by AI.
AI is changing the workplace.
Right, like worker monitoring
Yeah.
and how AI is used in making decisions about hiring and firing.
So you got to be transparent with employees about how you're using AI.
And it seems like they're really emphasizing that.
Yeah.
Even if you're using AI to make decisions about people,
A human still has to be ultimately responsible.
right, a human has to have the final say,
Okay.
especially in sensitive areas like hiring or disciplinary actions.
And it seems like this whole area of legal responsibility for AI,
It's still evolving.
it's really complex.
Yeah,
And it's
lots of gray areas.
uncertain. So organizations are really going to have to
You got to be careful.
manage those risks.
Right.
Yeah.
And, if you have a really robust compliance system,
Right.
that can help.
Okay.
It shows that you're taking things seriously.
Right. And then this distinction between provider.